since you were a kid? Were you always fascinated by space and space travel?
I was a child in the 60s, and I grew up with this stuff, and it was all the games, TV programs, and it was a wonderful time to be a kid. Anything seemed possible. There was such a sense of like, we can do anything we put our mind to, and I remember a teacher at my school saying, "You're lucky, you kids, because by the time you get to my age, you're going to be having holidays in space." It didn't quite work out that way, but
how did you get started on making this film?
it all started really with Martha Chaffee, the lovely Martha Chaffee, who I had the pleasure of meeting when I was directing another space film called The Last Man on the Moon, about the astronaut Eugene Cernan, Apollo 17 commander. And in that interview, she shared so much with us about the Apollo 1 thing that it really planted the seed. And then Martha introduced me to other family members, and once the families were on board, that gave license, I think, to a number of other people to come to get involved. Because obviously it's a very sensitive story to tell, and it was extra difficult in some ways to get access to certain locations, like, for example, the launch pad, which is controlled by the Air Force and things like that. In case you haven't twigged, I'm a foreigner, and they don't let foreigners walk all over your military property with cameras without quite a bit of paperwork. Luckily.
You must be a very persuasive filmmaker to get your way into all these spaces.
I think you've got to be a patient filmmaker with things like that. And in all seriousness, I think that there was a collective will from the families to get this film made. Yeah. They saw what I did on the Gene Cernan film, thought, okay, well, we trust you, which is, not a small thing. And I felt a certain good amount of pressure, burden of that, and I wanted to do them right. I wanted to do those three men justice, and just really wanted to tell the personal story that people may not have heard before.
Yes, well, it is, I think, a brave, announcement to say that you're going to make this film, because once you decide you're going to start making it and you tell people, the families, there's no going back, right?
There is no going back, and then suddenly the pandemic hit, just when I thought I'd got it all kind of going, and then we didn't know what we were going to be doing and when then. And of course, I was having conversations with potential funders of the film, and I was asking them to put their money where my mouth was, and yeah. So I think I think if you're going to set out to make a film, you just got to fix your eyes on the summit of this mountain we have to climb, and just don't look down. Just keep going, keep fixed on the goal, and just be patient. And I think in the end it all came good, although it did take a few years for it all to come.
Yeah, well, 50 years to start, right? For those family members to even be ready to tell the story, right? And so, yeah, I assume this movie couldn't have been made in 1980, right? It had to be made now, right?
Yeah, I think in 1980 it would still have been quite raw for the people involved. Who, I mean, certainly the families wanted to just, put it behind and move on, and certainly NASA was not as open then. I think the culture at NASA has really changed in recent years. I mean, and there have been 3 significant accidents, and I think now they realize, what, if we're going to understand what goes wrong here, we can't just bury it and hide it. We've got to get it out in the open. We've got to, be open with it. And so they were finally a little bit more accommodating of a film being made of it.
There were some comments, several in the film that said, "Oh, that spacecraft was riddled with problems," or "Oh, we were really going way too fast." And it seemed like you wouldn't have heard those sound bites or comments right after the disaster, right? Probably not much speaking to the press, right, around that time,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, there was an official investigation and a report that's about that thick and all the rest of it. But in human terms, you know, those engineers, those astronauts wouldn't have spoken in the way that they did.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I actually like making documentaries with older subjects, because by the time you know you get to a certain age, you just want to cut through the crap and speak very, you know, authentically about whatever it is you feel about, and I like that.
Yeah.
And certainly I think time gives you a different perspective on things as well. And you know, somehow it all came together with all the lovely archive footage that came out of these
Yeah,
jump
and so how did you get access to all that NASA footage?
the NASA footage, you know, is in the National Archives in DC and down in Houston, and that's accessible to anybody that cares.
Public domain, I guess?
It's in the public domain. They made it free to use. Now, not. I mean, obviously, as we since that time, you know, it was shot on film, and then at some point it was transferred to analog tape, and then at some point it was transferred to digital tape, and then after a while they think, you know, we're spending a lot of money just transferring this film, so they kind of stopped doing that. So now we're in the era of, you know, memory cards, which you know, 4K, for example. So some films hadn't been transferred, so we still had to pay for them to be transferred as to a format we could use. You know, they provide photographs as well, but the stuff I was really interested in was the family stuff and all those little network TV or even local TV reports, like the one that interviewed Martha on the steps of her house as soon as Roger had been selected. That was a wonderful discovery.
Yeah, My Daddy's a Rocket Man. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that was really
And
cute.
then the other one, I figured I'd seen photographs of Ed White, you know, speaking in front of the Alamo. And I was aware he was born in San Antonio. And I thought, well, you know, he was a very famous guy that week. You know, there has to be some footage somewhere. But of course, a lot of local TV stations don't exist anymore, and all the media gets acquired by some other new media corporation, and then another merges with another media corporation, and so it's very difficult to trace these things. But anyway, we managed to find this film. It had never been transferred, so we didn't know what we were going to get until we paid $300 to get it. And of course, you know, it's a wonderful historical record of an exciting time, which the whole of the White family remembered. And that's just you know, worth remembering, because I know the focus was so much on the guys, but you know, the families were very much hooked into all that, you know, and I wanted some of the wives to be part of this story, and certainly the kids as well.
Was there anyone that was particularly hard to reach or agree to interview, or anyone that you're allowed to mention that you couldn't get, or anyone maybe that you wish you could have gotten before they passed away?
I had my sights on Frank Borman, great Apollo commander of Apollo 8, that was the first to leave planet Earth and, you know, see that incredible Earthrise for the first time. He was put in charge of the investigation. And I would have liked to have heard what he said about it. There is an oral history. A lot of these astronauts and, you know, space program managers provided audio interviews, and that exists. And I did look at it. Thing about Frank Borman and a lot of these guys, you know, they're often men of very few words, and they're military, and they just say it, and then, so in some ways I wish I had interviewed him, but I think I don't think maybe he would have said any more than he did for the oral history. So, but in terms of persuading people, I mean, the Chaffees came forward very willingly. Lowell Grissom, you know, he's a real trooper, been talking about his brother for years.
Yeah.
Ed White's son, Ed White III, he's become a bit of an expert in the subject of his father. I think, you know, the one that found it most difficult in many ways was Ed's daughter, Bonnie. You know, it happened, she was so young when it happened. You've seen that footage of her dad's funeral. She's just a little girl, and it just absolutely broke her heart, you know, and so she just wanted to, you know, move on from it. And of course that family also lost their uncle and their mom. And so when we first started having conversations about it, I said, Bonnie, I'd love you to take part in this film. And she goes, well, it's very difficult for me to go back there and talk about it. I've been working at this company for 20 years, and a lot of my workmates don't even know who my dad was. You know, she's kept it very private. So of all the people in that film, you know, I'm especially grateful to her for being brave enough to go in front of camera and share and give us, you know, her perspective.
Yeah, that is nice to have her for sure. Well, each of these astronauts is so entertaining, right? And Roger and Ed, and I really loved learning more about Gus, and just kind of, you didn't have a lot of sound bites from him, but seeing his demeanor and hearing the stories about him, you know, he was this fearless guy, obviously a big risk taker, you know, and you know, kind of not afraid to die, right? Like he was on a mission, and he knew the risks, and but he cared a lot, obviously, too. You know, the way he was inspecting the space capsule himself, and you know, engineering things himself. It was really amazing to see what type of person he was. It seems like he had a big impact on the culture there at NASA at that time, and then his memory, I think, really motivated people after, right? Like the spirit of Gus really lived on afterwards.
For sure. I mean, there's many layers to any human being, but Gus was, you know, a veteran of 100 combat missions. You know, he was an original old school hard guy, tough nut.
Test pilot.
So, yeah, exactly. Military test pilot.
Yeah.
So he's flying all kinds of stuff, and of course was only the third person ever to go into space in very new machinery, which of course, you know, malfunctioned when he hit the water and nearly drowned. So, but you know, he was also a family guy. I think he was just the ultimate no nonsense kind of guy, just as I hope we convey in the film, just not interested in the media, you know, there's a whole PR side to what astronauts have to do now. And we've all seen it with the crew of Artemis 2, who are like model astronauts with all the
social media channels and everything.
Social media, yeah, Gus would have hated all that, you know, but that's part of the deal now of being an astronaut. Taxpayers and all kinds of investors have put them in there. They want them to talk about it when they come back. But Gus, you know, blocked out all his windows and led the quiet life.
Yeah.
Bless him.
Well, what's interesting also is how at NASA, as you explain in the film, they all knew that there was a lot of risk here. But do you think the general public knew about these risks?
No, I think the public were very aware that it was a risky business, because, you know, before they put humans inside the rockets, they'd seen them blowing up quite spectacularly during the test launches. They'd seen a capsule sink. You know, throughout the Gemini program, they all came back, but there were, you know, some interesting situations with Gemini 8. You know, Neil Armstrong had a right old problem to deal with a stuck thruster. Gene Cernan had a terrible spacewalk, which, you know, caused problems. So I think it was certainly risky, but I think the nature of Apollo 1 meant that that came out of the blue. You know, they didn't expect an accident like that to happen on the ground. They expected bad things to potentially happen in space, and that was why it was so unexpected and shocking, I think.
Yeah. Well, the nation must have been holding its breath for 2.5 years then, 67 January to July 69. That's incredible that they made all that progress.
I mean, ultimately, it's this incredible success story, and unfortunately, you know, Apollo 1 almost needed to happen for the things to go right.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have said, you know what, if there had been a problem with that spacecraft in space and it was caught fire, you know, in orbit or whatever, then we wouldn't have known what went wrong. The fact that it happened on the ground meant that there was some wreckage to dive into and examine and figure it out.
Do you think that this tragedy inspired them to work even harder and be even more persistent in safety and preparation?
I think if anything, it made them work not so much harder, but just smarter and a bit slower, because there was this incredible rush to beat the Russians and get to the moon before the end of the decade and all that kind of stuff. And that's where mistakes were being made. But the sacrifice of these three men are what ultimately paved the way for a very successful story of not just Apollo 11, but the whole space program ever since has learned some very valuable lessons stemming back to this particular tragedy.
One thing these young people might find inspiring is how you were able to just on your own go meet the characters in this story and convince them to make a movie. You know, you had some past credibility with your previous films, but it's not like you worked for NASA or you have some special access or family members. You just said, I know this is a good story, and you're not even American, you're British, and that didn't hold you back either. So you know, how might that story relate to these young folks who are thinking of going out and just finding a story to tell?
Yeah, I mean, every documentary film really is a different journey. No two films are really alike. The team of people you work with are often different. The people in front of the screen are different, and each one requires a unique approach. The one thing I will say, especially with a sensitive subject like this, it's all about relationship building. My calling card was the previous space film. I'd met a few astronauts, and you know, they'd seen the film and liked it, so that helped. So I think basically I was able to at least get people on board with the idea of a film, but then you still got to find the money to make it.
Well, right, yeah.
And you know, it's not a cheap film. So I was just beginning to make all that come together, and suddenly we're hit with the COVID pandemic. And for the longest time, nobody was going anywhere. And so there was a year or two where I really didn't think this film was ever going to happen, because, you know, some people who appear in it, you know, were not getting any younger, and we weren't going anywhere. And
you didn't want to do Zoom interviews for this film,
no,
right?
No. I don't just want to do interviews. I want to film people in places. You know, I want to take them back to the old launch pad, or I want to put them together looking at an old family photo album, because like brother and sister, you know, Ed and Bonnie, out of that comes an ingredient which I wouldn't know how to create in an interview, you know. I think interviews are great for the basic information that you need, the basic building blocks, but then you want B-roll or observational footage, just to let your characters live and breathe and do what they do, and take them to a place where their memories are really jogged. That can be a location, it can be a scrapbook that they go through, turning a page, and suddenly they'll start talking about something that I would never have thought to ask them.
It's amazing how you can get people to loosen up when they're just doing the dishes or something and talking to you at the same time.
Yeah.
As opposed to sitting down and they're very aware that the camera's right there.
You've got to spend a bit of time with people. I mean, I like putting a little radio mic on them and having a camera sort of over there somewhere, that they know they're being filmed, but the camera's not right in their face. and I'm not speaking to them the whole time. They're just doing their thing, you know. And often out of that comes little hints of a life which again, I wouldn't think to ask. I loved it when, you know, we were doing some filming with Martha Chaffee. It was the first day we filmed, actually. And she goes, "Hey, I'm thirsty, you know, do you guys want a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And she goes, and we were just managing the media and talking amongst ourselves. And she just went over to the window with a mug which had Roger That on it. And I said to the camera, I said, "Oh, get a shot of Martha."
Yeah, I noticed that, the Roger That coffee mug. That was very
you know,
cute.
and that wasn't staged. You know, I didn't know she had a mug that, but it tells us a little something that he, in some tangible way, is still a part of her life. You know,
She was literally hanging on to him still,
yeah,
right?
She's got postcards that she wrote.
Yeah.
You know, she keeps by the bed. I mean, there's so much in there that you know you'd want to put in. But you have to make choices, and some good stuff ends up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, and so I think is really great is that this is a very sensitive subject, you know, an important history that couldn't have been told a few years after it happened. You know, there had to be this passage of time where people could speak freely about it, and it seems like you were not beholden to any sort of portrayal of the event, right? Like each of your subjects just told you what they were going to tell you, but you had the final cut, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously with any subject matter, you dive into a whole lot of research. You know, research is really important to at least you know, understand who the main characters were, the main events, and from that research you begin to pin down key events, and you go, okay, well I can structure the film around this a little bit, but you don't know all the personal stuff. So what I like to do is at least create, like, if you like, a framework, a rough sketch of what I think the film will be. But inevitably you speak to somebody and a bit of information comes your way that you weren't expecting, and you have to kind of go back to your master plan, which in my case is just a bunch of postcards on a table, which I, you know, write on, and I'm swapping them around, and you just figure it out. You just try and figure out the best story.